It's that time of year again when it's dark. It feels like all the time, but we still want to go out and take photos. So what better time than now to talk about low-light photography? It's Tutorial Tuesday. Welcome back to Tutorial Tuesday, where each and every Tuesday we bring you a brand new, fresh photography tutorial. Right now, of course, we've got videos every day through to Christmas Eve as well, so anything in particular you might want to see, pop it down in the comments because I'll do my best to absolutely get to it. We've already had some great suggestions, which we will absolutely be getting to. Things like time lapses, there's some photos from a couple of years ago, low light photos that I'm actually going to go through in more detail, but this video, we're going to talk about low light photography, how to capture photos in lower light. So as the light is fading from the sky, or perhaps it's dark because it seems to be dark all the time at the moment. So whether it's evening, later in the evening, you want to capture kind of more of a street scene, you want to get portraits, you want to get landscapes, we're going to talk about how you can capture better low light photos. We're going to go through some tips. Let's get into it. So first up, let's talk about settings. Now, a few of these may seem obvious, but I think it's important to run through them. First up, aperture. Now, realistically, you want to be using the widest aperture, the fastest aperture that you can use. That means a lower f-stop number. f2.8 is great, but if you have a prime lens that goes f1.8, f1.4, that's going to be amazing. It's going to let more light into your camera, onto that sensor, and that is just going to help with exposing in lower light. You can also help the situation by using a slower shutter speed, so 1/60th of a second, 1/50th of a second. Now, often this is actually doable handheld because a lot of cameras now have in-body image stabilization, which really helps with using a slower shutter speed. You're not going to have so much shake from your hands because it's going to be image stabilized. So using a slower shutter speed absolutely can be a great way to let more light onto that sensor again and capture a low light photo. Now, that doesn't work so well if you've got a moving subject or you've got a situation where there's going to be some sort of movement in the scene and you don't want to have blur or kind of a long exposure look to things. So that's something to keep in mind, but otherwise a slower shutter speed lets more light in. Now with ISO, a lot of cameras now are able to pump that up without experiencing too many problems in terms of digital noise. So for example, 3200, 6400, that's going to really brighten your image, and if you're not experiencing too much digital noise, that's a great way of exposing in lower light situations. Now, the easiest way to work out how this is going to look is to just go out and do a test with your camera. So take it out, shoot an image at ISO 1000, for example, 1600, 3200, 6400, get them back, pop them onto your computer, and have a look at how they look. Is there a lot of noise? Does it look muddy? Does it look soft because it's too grainy? Experiment a little bit, see where your camera can get to and still get decent results, and then go with it. Then you know kind of where your limit is for the kind of photos you want to get. Then you know what kind of ISO you can use, and that's going to inform things like shutter speed and aperture a little bit in terms of capturing those low light photos. And of course, things like aperture and shutter speed can also be used for kind of a creative look as well. Now, something else that's going to massively help with exposing your images is using a tripod. And this is something I do whenever I go out to take low light photos. I'll almost always take a tripod with me because it means that I can lock that in place and pop on a slower shutter speed. I don't have to worry at all about camera shake or anything like that. So if I'm taking street scenes, if I'm taking, some sort of photo of a low light landscape or something like that, a tripod is absolutely going to change how I can take that photo. Now, if you don't want to take a tripod around with you, for example, maybe you're in the city and you don't want to be carrying it around, that's absolutely fine. You can just rest your camera on something in the area, pop a 2-second timer on, go to take the photo. That 2-second timer is just going to eliminate any kind of shake from you pressing the shutter, and you're going to go ahead and take a really nice photo. Now, when I was in Rome, I did exactly this. I didn't want to have a tripod out with me. I was out, it was late, it was dark, but I wanted to get some nice photos, so I just rested it on a little pillar. Perfect. Managed to compose the photo as I wanted it to. You don't have quite as much kind of flexibility for how you're going to be able to actually sit the camera, but it doesn't really matter. If you can compose the photo, you're going to get a nice long shutter speed, let lots of light in. Perfect. Now, something to bear in mind when you're shooting low light photography is that a lot of areas will look completely different in the dark compared to in the day. Some areas that are great for photography in the day will be no good at night. Absolutely no good. And some areas that are super boring and not interesting at all in the day will be amazing at night. It's all about finding the light. Now, of course, we're talking low light, but that still means having light and looking for light sources that can work in your photo is a massive part of making a good low light photo, capturing something good. So if you've got a subject, like you're taking portraits, for example, or even if not, you want to find a light source that was going to shine either onto your subject or just illuminate the scene or create an interesting visual area of the photo. So when I'm taking portraits in lower light, I'm generally looking for some kind of shop sign, some kind of street light that is interesting, it gives off an interesting light, and I can use that to light my subject. You might need to move around a little bit, you might need to move your subject around a little bit for how the light is actually going to fall onto them, but that can be a great way to light up your subject in that situation. You could also go for something like a silhouette. So in lower light situations, if the sun is setting, for example, you could use a silhouette. You have your subject in the foreground, you expose for that light in the background, and you have your subject just completely in shadow. That can work against the sky, it can work against lights kind of all around you. There's a lot of great ways to go for a silhouette. It can be a really good way to actually go for a low light photo without having to pump up that ISO as much. Something else which is really, really great, and my favorite thing in low light, is when it's been raining and you've got that wet ground reflecting all the lights. You've got puddles which make for great reflections, and it just adds so much visual interest to the scene, because now all of a sudden you have, yes, the lights, but they're reflected off the ground. So it's almost like you've got lights everywhere, and that can be really, really powerful. Lastly, I think it's important to talk about editing. Now, this can really, really bring an image together, especially a low light image, because the number of times I've taken photos in low light conditions, but the settings I've applied have made it seem really bright compared to how it actually was, is amazing. It can be really, really strange, to be honest, to see the world with your eyes being kind of dark, but you set your settings, you take your photo and you expose in such a way that it almost looks like daytime, almost looks much brighter. And that can be problematic because that might not be the look you want for your photo. You know, it's great to get a nice bright exposure because you can then play around with it so much in post. And a big part of this is to always shoot in RAW so that you can affect things like white balance, you can affect things like exposure with much, much more kind of detail. You've got so much more to play with there. So shooting in RAW is absolutely a huge advantage when taking low light photos, but being able to then edit them in post is a big, big deal. Now, if you've got one of those bright photos I talked about where you've taken a photo in what seems like the dark, but it seems very bright in post, that's a great situation to then be able to manipulate that in the way you want it. You can make it look how you want it to look. And oftentimes, if you have a bright photo and it looks like there's a bit of digital noise there, just bringing that exposure down can really work wonders to actually reduce that noise. Even once you're in Lightroom or Photoshop or Capture One or whatever it is, just bringing that exposure down can really hide a huge amount of that digital noise, which can make the photo end up looking fantastic. Now, we've really just scratched the surface there with low light photography, so I'd love to hear some of your tips down in the comments. That's kind of my immediate checklist when I go out and do low light, you know, tripod settings, thinking about the edit, looking for light sources, all that kind of stuff. That's kind of my immediate checklist, but I'd love to hear anything else you think about when you go out and take low light photos. Of course, there's a full list of all the kit used for this video, and of course, all the photos down in the description, so you can check that out. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, because first of all, I appreciate it, but second of all, there's new content every day through to the 24th of December, so we've got new stuff all the time. All that's left for me to say, of course, is I will see you tomorrow, but as always, thanks for watching.